For years, his sister lived in the shadows, unaware, unnoticed, until fate brought them together. He never knew she existed, never imagined the truth. But when she picked up an old necklace from the hospital floor, everything changed forever. Eduardo Blackwell had spent his life chasing success, believing that power defined a man's worth. Raised by an elite family, he was conditioned to see emotions as distractions and relationships as liabilities. He built an empire with ruthless precision, ensuring that nothing and no one could shake his control. But fate had other plans. The accident happened fast. A blur of headlights, the screech of tires, and then darkness. When he woke up, pain shot through his body, a cruel reminder that even the powerful could fall. He was in a hospital bed, stripped of his tailored suits, his boardroom dominance reduced to weakness. And the nurse assigned to his care? A woman he barely noticed at first. Anna had spent years tending to patients who saw her as just another uniform. She was used to being overlooked, ignored. But something about Eduardo unsettled her. A familiarity she couldn't explain. And then one small moment changed everything. A necklace slipped from his belongings, hitting the cold hospital floor. She recognized it instantly. An identical one had been left to her by the mother she lost too soon. Her heart pounded as she picked it up, realization crashing over her like a wave. Could it be? Was it possible? The truth was a whisper at the edge of her mind, growing louder with every second. Eduardo wasn't just another patient. He was part of a past she thought was lost forever. But how do you tell a man who built his life on certainty that his world is a lie? How do you reveal a family secret that could destroy everything? Anna wasn't sure. All she knew was that this moment had changed both of their lives forever. Eduardo Blackwell had never believed in destiny. He believed in power, in control, in carving his own path without interference. Raised in a world where wealth dictated worth, he learned early that emotions were a liability. He was taught to lead with strategy, not sentiment, and he had perfected that art. While others sought connection, Eduardo thrived in isolation. Business was his language, money his loyalty. He didn't waste time on relationships. They were distractions, unpredictable, uncontrollable. Love, family, concepts for the weak. His empire was built on ruthless efficiency, not on the bonds that tied lesser men to mediocrity. Every aspect of his life was structured, precise. He had no patience for mistakes, no room for vulnerability. Meetings at dawn, negotiations before lunch, stock reports by evening. His world ran like a machine, cold and unstoppable. And that was exactly how he liked it. Even his personal life followed strict rules. Casual relationships, no attachments, no lingering emotions. He had everything a man could want: status, influence, the power to bend the world to his will. Or so he thought, until the accident. One moment of weakness, 1 second of lost control, and his entire world shifted. Waking up in a hospital bed, stripped of power, dependent on strangers. It was the first crack in the armor he had spent decades perfecting. And the woman standing by his bedside? Just another nurse, or so he assumed. He didn't know it yet, but fate had just played its hand. His past was about to return in the most unexpected way, and no amount of power, wealth, or denial would be enough to keep it buried. Anna had spent her entire life on the sidelines, unnoticed by the world. She wasn't the kind of person people remembered. She had no grand ambitions, no hunger for power, just a quiet determination to help others. And for years, that had been enough. Hospitals were her second home, filled with faces that came and went. Some patients were kind, others indifferent, and a few, like Eduardo Blackwell, were impossible. Cold, impatient, demanding. He saw her as nothing more than another nameless figure in his recovery. And Anna was used to that. She had spent a lifetime being invisible. But something about him unsettled her. It wasn't his arrogance or his wealth. It was something deeper. A strange familiarity she couldn't shake. Like trying to remember a song she had once known by heart. She told herself it was nothing. Just another patient. Just another day. Then came the moment that changed everything. A necklace slipped from his belongings, clinking against the floor. Anna bent down to pick it up, and her breath caught. The chain, the delicate pendant, the engraving on the back. It was identical to the one she had worn since childhood. Memories flooded her mind. Her mother's voice, whispering about a brother she had lost. A child taken away, a family torn apart. Could it be possible? Was Eduardo, this man who treated her like a stranger, the same brother she had spent years wondering about? Her hands trembled as she held the necklace, reality crashing down on her. This wasn't coincidence. This was fate. And now, she had a choice. Bury the truth or uncover a past that neither of them was prepared to face. Anna sat in the dim hospital break room, the necklace resting in her palm. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of a story she had never fully understood. Her mother's whispers about a lost brother, the secrecy surrounding his disappearance. Could Eduardo really be that child? The thought seemed impossible, yet the evidence was right in front of her. Doubt gnawed at her. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a mistake. But deep down, she knew better. The pendant, the design, the engraving, they were too identical to ignore. And then there was the familiarity, the strange sense that she had known him all along. It wasn't just a hunch. It was a truth waiting to be uncovered. She glanced at Eduardo's hospital room through the glass window. He looked the same, detached, emotionless, powerful even in weakness. How could someone like him be her family? He was everything she wasn't. Wealthy, confident, ruthless. And yet, for the first time, she saw him not as a businessman, but as something more. But how do you tell a man who prides himself on control that his entire life is a lie? That the family he trusted stole him from the one who truly loved him? She imagined his reaction, denial, anger, maybe even cruelty. He wouldn't believe her. Why would he? To him, she was just a nurse, nothing more. A part of her wanted to walk away, to pretend she had never seen the necklace. It would be easier that way. But another part, the part that had always longed for answers, wouldn't let her. She had spent her life wondering if her brother was out there, somewhere. And now that she had found him, could she really turn her back? Taking a deep breath, she made her choice. She wouldn't tell him, not yet. She needed more than a feeling. She needed proof, something undeniable. If Eduardo was truly her brother, then the truth would come out, one way or another. And when it did, there would be no going back. She clutched the necklace tightly before slipping it into her pocket. This wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about redemption, lost inheritance, and a destiny neither of them had expected. And whether Eduardo was ready or not, his life was about to change forever. Anna found herself drawn to Eduardo in ways she couldn't explain. Every interaction, every glance, felt heavier now. She carried the weight of a truth he didn't know, a secret that could shatter his carefully constructed world. And yet, as she observed him, she noticed something different. Something even he didn't seem to realize. Despite his cold demeanor, there were cracks in his armor. She saw it in the way his gaze lingered on her longer than before. In the quiet moments, when he thought no one was watching, there was something almost lost in his expression. A loneliness he would never admit, but one she recognized all too well. Eduardo didn't understand why Anna unsettled him. She was just a nurse, yet her presence lingered in his mind. There was something oddly familiar about her. The way she spoke, the way she looked at him, it irritated him, confused him, made him question things he never had before. And Eduardo Blackwell was not a man who questioned. Anna tried to keep her emotions hidden, but the more time she spent with him, the harder it became. She wanted to tell him the truth, to reach out, to break the distance between them. But how do you bridge a gap when the other person doesn't even know it exists? How do you reconnect with someone who doesn't even know he's lost? Every day, the urge to reveal the truth grew stronger. She found herself wanting to ask questions, to see if he remembered anything. Did he ever wonder about his past? Did he ever feel like something was missing? Or had the Blackwells erased every trace of who he was supposed to be? Then came a moment neither of them expected. A fleeting touch, a brief conversation, a shared silence that felt like recognition. Eduardo dismissed it as nothing. But for Anna, it was everything. For the first time, she saw a future where maybe, just maybe, he would finally know who he really was. But the truth had a way of revealing itself, whether she was ready or not. And soon, fate would force them both to confront what had been hidden for so long. Eduardo prided himself on his ability to read people. He could detect lies, anticipate threats, and see through hidden motives. It was how he built his empire, by separating emotion from logic, keeping absolute control. But something about Anna unsettled him, something he couldn't quite define. She was just a nurse, yet there were moments when her gaze felt different. As if she knew him, as if she saw something in him that even he didn't recognize. There was patience in the way she spoke to him, a quiet kindness that felt personal. And for the first time, he found himself wondering why. Then came the first detail he couldn't ignore. One night, as Anna entered his hospital room, her eyes landed on the necklace lying on the bedside table. Eduardo noticed a change in her expression. Not curiosity, but recognition. And for a split second, he saw something else, shock, hesitation. "This necklace," Anna began, but stopped herself before finishing. There was something in her voice that sent a jolt through him. "What about it?" Eduardo asked, sharper than he intended. Anna hesitated, then forced a small smile. "Nothing. I just thought it looked nice." But something in her tone made him suspicious. She knew something he didn't. Eduardo had never cared for sentimental objects, but that necklace was the only thing left from his childhood. It had been found with him when he was adopted, a symbol of a past he had never questioned. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he should. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. Eduardo watched Anna with renewed interest. Who was she, really? And why did he feel like she was holding a secret that could change everything? Doubt settled in his mind, growing with every passing second. And the more he thought about it, the more certain he became. His past, the one he had never questioned, was about to unravel. Eduardo tried to push the thought away, but it lingered. Anna's reaction to the necklace wasn't normal. He had spent years ignoring his past, dismissing it as irrelevant. But now, a quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered that something wasn't right. And once a seed of doubt was planted, it was impossible to ignore. He started watching Anna more closely. There was something in the way she looked at him, a hesitation, an awareness, as if she was waiting for him to realize something on his own. Every conversation felt heavier now, every moment charged with an unspoken truth. Eduardo didn't believe in fate, but he couldn't deny the feeling that something was pulling him toward her. One evening, unable to silence his curiosity, he confronted her. "You've been acting strange," he said, his voice firm. Anna hesitated, caught off guard, but quickly composed herself. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, too quickly. Eduardo wasn't fooled. He knew when someone was hiding something. She tried to change the subject, but he wasn't letting it go. "The necklace," he pressed. "You recognized it." Anna's breath hitched for just a second, a tiny crack in her composure. That was all the confirmation he needed. She knew something, and he was going to find out what. Anna wanted to tell him the truth, but fear held her back. Would he believe her? Would he even care? She had spent her life wondering if she had a brother out there. And now that she had found him, she was terrified of losing him all over again. But the truth had a way of revealing itself, with or without her consent. Eduardo wasn't a man who let things go. Once he sensed deception, he pursued the truth relentlessly. And now that truth was within reach. What he didn't realize was that uncovering it would change everything. Forever. Eduardo had always believed that power came from knowledge. But now, standing in front of Anna, he realized there was something he didn't know. Something important. The way she avoided his eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when he pressed her for answers. It was clear she was hiding something. And Eduardo Blackwell didn't tolerate secrets. Not when they involved him. The air between them was thick with tension. Anna had spent weeks holding on to the truth, hoping to find the right moment to tell him. But now, she could feel the moment slipping away. Eduardo wasn't the type to wait. He was relentless, demanding, unwilling to let anything go unanswered. And she wasn't sure she was ready for what came next. Eduardo took a step closer, his voice low, controlled. "You know something about me," he said, "and I want to know what it is." Ana swallowed hard, her pulse racing. There was no turning back now. She had prepared herself for this moment, but now that it was here, she felt like a child again, standing on the edge of a truth too big to handle. She reached into her pocket, fingers wrapping around the necklace, the one identical to his. Slowly, she pulled it out, letting it rest in her palm. Eduardo's eyes flickered to the pendant, and for the first time, she saw something in his expression that wasn't control. It was doubt, recognition, fear. The reaction was brief, but it was there, and it was enough. "This belonged to my mother," Ana finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Eduardo's jaw tightened, his mind racing. There were 1,000 logical explanations for this. Coincidence, a mistake, a trick. But deep inside, something in him knew. This wasn't random. This was personal. And suddenly, his past didn't feel so certain anymore. For years, he had dismissed the gaps in his history, the unanswered questions about his adoption. He had never cared before. Why would he? But now, standing before Ana, staring at the proof in her hands, he felt something shift. A crack in the foundation of everything he believed. And for the first time in his life, Eduardo Blackwell felt truly unprepared. The room felt smaller, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Ana waited, watching him carefully, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. The truth was out now, hanging between them, waiting to be acknowledged. And Eduardo had no choice but to face it. Eduardo stared at the necklace in Ana's hand, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. For years, he had dismissed his past as irrelevant, a story that had no bearing on his carefully built life. But now, with undeniable proof in front of him, the walls he had built around his identity began to crack. The coincidence was impossible, and yet he still refused to believe. Ana took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she spoke. "Eduardo, you're my brother." The words felt heavy, final, like a door slamming shut on the life he thought he knew. He wanted to reject it, to tell her she was wrong, that this was all some mistake. But deep inside, something in him recognized the truth, and that terrified him. Silence stretched between them, thick with emotion. Ana searched his face, hoping for recognition, for something beyond the cold disbelief in his eyes. But Eduardo had spent a lifetime learning how to shut people out. And now, even in the face of undeniable truth, he refused to let himself feel. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't his reality. He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "That's impossible," he said, his voice tight, controlled. Ana's heart clenched at his resistance, but she had expected it. "It's true," she insisted. "I've spent my life wondering if my brother was out there. I never thought I'd find you like this." But Eduardo didn't want to be found. Not like this. A storm raged inside him. His entire existence had been built on certainty. His name, his lineage, his place in the world. But now, none of it felt real. If Ana was telling the truth, then everything he believed about himself was a lie. And Eduardo Blackwell didn't know how to exist without control. He couldn't afford to lose himself now. Ana could see the conflict in his eyes, the battle between logic and emotion. She had given him the truth, but he wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet, maybe not ever. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You don't have to believe me right now, but you know this isn't a lie. You feel it, don't you?" Eduardo's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer, because deep down he did. Without another word, he turned and walked away. Ana watched him go, her heart aching, knowing that this was only the beginning. The truth was out, but the battle for acceptance had just begun. And Eduardo had a choice: run from the past or finally face it. Eduardo walked through the hospital corridors, his mind clouded with thoughts he didn't want to entertain. His entire life, he had relied on logic, facts, and control. But now, everything he thought he knew about himself had been thrown into question. Anna's words echoed in his mind, no matter how much he tried to silence them. He wasn't her brother. He couldn't be. The logical part of him searched for another explanation. Maybe Anna was mistaken, grasping at a connection that didn't exist. Maybe the necklace was a coincidence, nothing more. But deep inside, a voice he couldn't ignore whispered the truth. A truth that threatened to unravel the life he had built. And he wasn't ready for that. He reached his hospital room and shut the door behind him, needing a moment to breathe. His reflection in the mirror stared back at him. Same face, same man, yet everything felt different. If Anna was right, then who was he, really? Had his entire life been a carefully crafted lie? He clenched his fists, frustration boiling beneath the surface. He refused to believe it. Meanwhile, Anna sat alone in the staff lounge, her heart heavy. She had expected Eduardo to reject the truth at first, but it still hurt. She had spent years wondering if she had family out there, and now that she had found him, he was slipping through her fingers. But she wouldn't give up. Not yet. Eduardo was not a man who accepted change easily. He fought against things he couldn't control, and this was no different. But the past had a way of creeping in whether he wanted it to or not. Ignoring the truth wouldn't change it. And as much as he wanted to pretend nothing had happened, he couldn't erase what he now knew. The hours passed, but the turmoil inside him didn't fade. He had built his life on certainty, but now nothing felt certain anymore. He could deny it all he wanted, but the questions wouldn't go away. And deep down, he knew, sooner or later, he would have to face the truth. But facing the truth meant confronting more than just Anna. It meant uncovering the secrets of his past. And Eduardo wasn't sure he was ready for what he might find. Eduardo couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, Anna's voice echoed in his mind. "You're my brother." The words felt unreal, impossible. And yet, the doubt had already taken root. No matter how much he wanted to dismiss it, he needed answers. The next morning, he found himself doing something he had never done before, digging into his own past. He had never cared about the details of his adoption, never questioned the story he had been told. But now, every piece of that story felt like a carefully placed lie, and he intended to uncover the truth. He started with the adoption records. With his influence, getting access wasn't difficult. But as he read through the documents, something didn't add up. There were inconsistencies, dates that didn't match, missing signatures, altered information. It was subtle, but to Eduardo it was a red flag. Meanwhile, Anna refused to stay on the sidelines. She had waited too long to find him to simply walk away. She began her own search, reaching out to people who had known her mother. Old friends, distant relatives, anyone who might have information. And slowly, pieces of the puzzle started to come together. Then, Eduardo found something that made his stomach tighten. A name, one he didn't recognize but felt important. Someone involved in the adoption process, someone who might have answers. He had spent his life solving problems, and now he was treating this as just another case. But this time, the stakes were personal. Anna's search led her to something just as shocking, a photograph. An old, faded picture of her mother holding two infants. Her heart pounded as she traced the image with her fingers. There was no mistaking it. Two children, a brother and a sister, the proof she needed. Eduardo thought he was the one searching for the truth. But the truth was already coming for him. And soon, he would have no choice but to face it. Eduardo sat in his office, staring at the adoption file on his desk. The inconsistencies, the missing details, they weren't coincidences. Someone had gone to great lengths to cover the truth. And now, he was closer than ever to uncovering what they wanted to keep hidden. But was he ready for what he might find? For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure. Across town, Anna clutched the old photograph in her hands. Her heart pounded as she traced the faces of the two infants. The woman holding them, her mother, had never spoken much about the past. But here was proof undeniable and real. She hadn't imagined it. She hadn't been wrong. Eduardo was her brother. Now she just had to make him believe it. Eduardo's investigation led him to the name in the files, a retired social worker who had handled his adoption. He didn't waste time. Within hours, he was knocking on the door of a modest home, heart pounding as an elderly woman answered. Her eyes widened in recognition before he even spoke. "I was wondering when you'd come," she murmured. Inside, the truth spilled out in pieces. His adoption hadn't been a simple case of abandonment. There had been pressure, coercion, a family desperate to erase their connection to the past. The Blackwells had wanted an heir, but they hadn't wanted the baggage that came with him. And so they had rewritten his story. They had stolen him. Anna arrived at the hospital later that evening, determined to make Eduardo listen. She carried the photograph like a shield, ready to fight for the truth. But when she stepped into his room, she didn't need to say anything. Eduardo was already waiting, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said before she could even speak. "I know everything." The words sent a shiver through her. For so long, she had imagined this moment. But now that it was here, she realized the truth was only the beginning. Because knowing was one thing, accepting it was another. The past had finally caught up with Eduardo, and the hardest part was yet to come. Eduardo had spent his life mastering control. Every decision, every move was calculated, precise. But this was chaos. The truth was out, undeniable and irreversible. Yet he felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. Accepting it meant admitting that everything he believed was a lie, and he wasn't sure he could do that. Anna watched him carefully, sensing the battle raging inside him. She had imagined this moment for years, but she had never considered how difficult it would be. She wanted to reach out, to close the distance between them, but Eduardo looked like a man at war with himself. And for the first time, she wondered if he would ever truly accept her. His mind clung to logic, to reason. Adoption wasn't uncommon. Families took in children all the time. But this wasn't an act of love. It was theft, a carefully orchestrated deception. The Blackwells hadn't saved him. They had erased him. And now, he was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had never truly belonged to him. The anger came next. Not just at the Blackwells, but at himself. How had he never questioned it? How had he spent his entire life blind to the truth? He had been trained to see weaknesses in others, to find the cracks in every deal, every lie. And yet, he had missed the biggest deception of all, his own past. Anna saw the storm in his eyes and took a hesitant step forward. "You don't have to go through this alone," she said softly. But Eduardo let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I've always been alone." The words cut deeper than he intended, and for a moment, he saw the pain flicker across Anna's face. The weight of everything threatened to crush him. For years, he had defined himself by his success, his power, his name. But now, none of it felt real. If he wasn't Eduardo Blackwell, then who was he? And worse, if he accepted this truth, what would be left of the man he had spent his life becoming? Anna didn't press him for an answer. She knew this wasn't something he could accept overnight. But one thing was certain, the past had finally caught up with Eduardo. And whether he was ready or not, his life would never be the same again. Eduardo had spent years defending the Blackwells, believing they had given him everything. Now, he realized they had only taken his name, his past, his real family, all stolen in the name of power and control. And as he stood outside their grand estate, rage burned beneath his skin. It was time for answers. It was time for the truth. The moment he stepped inside, the tension was palpable. Eleanor and Richard Blackwell sat in the lavish sitting room, their expressions unreadable. "You should have called," Richard said, setting down his drink. Eduardo didn't waste time. "How long?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "How long have you been lying to me?" Eleanor's gaze barely flickered. "I see Anna has filled your head with nonsense." Eduardo clenched his fists. Even now, they refused to admit the truth. "I found the records," he shot back. "I spoke to the social worker. I know everything." A flicker of something, fear? Annoyance? Crossed Richard's face. But it was gone in an instant. "We did what was best for you," Eleanor finally said, her voice smooth, practiced. "You were nothing when we took you in. We gave you a name, a future, a life." The words sent a cold wave of disgust through him. They had never seen him as a son, only as an investment. "You stole me," Eduardo said, his voice dangerously low. "You took me from my real family and built my life on a lie." Richard sighed, standing. "And what do you plan to do about it?" His tone was almost amused, dismissive. They weren't afraid of him. They thought they still owned him, that he was still the boy they had molded into a Blackwell. But Eduardo wasn't that boy anymore, and they were about to realize it. "I'm taking back what's mine," Eduardo said, his voice steady. "My name, my legacy, everything you tried to erase." Eleanor's lips curled into a smile, cold and knowing. "And what makes you think we'll let you?" Eduardo met her gaze, unshaken. "Because for the first time in my life, I know who I really am." The confrontation was over, but the war had just begun. Eduardo had lived under their rules for too long. Now it was time to rewrite his own fate. Eduardo left the Blackwell estate with a storm raging inside him. For years, he had been their puppet, their perfect creation. Now he was something they never expected, a man who knew the truth. But knowing wasn't enough. He had to reclaim what was his. The first step was legal action. The Blackwells had buried his real identity under forged documents and sealed records. Undoing it wouldn't be easy, but Eduardo was never a man who backed down from a fight. With his resources and influence, he built a team dedicated to uncovering every piece of evidence they had tried to erase. Anna stood by his side, unwavering. She had spent years searching for him, and now that she had found him, she refused to let him fight alone. "They'll come after you," she warned. Eduardo knew that. The Blackwells weren't just wealthy, they were powerful. They wouldn't give up control without a battle. But Eduardo wasn't the same man they had raised. He was done living under their shadow. The retaliation came quickly. A smear campaign in the media, whispers of fraud, attempts to discredit him. The Blackwells had built an empire on manipulation, and now they were using every weapon at their disposal. But Eduardo had spent his life studying them. He knew their tactics, and he was prepared to strike back. While the legal case unfolded, Eduardo searched for something even more valuable, the last remaining traces of his birth family. If he could find proof of his origins, it would be the final blow against the Blackwell's control. And then he found it. A set of hidden documents, old letters, a truth too damning to ignore. They had taken him, but they had never truly erased his past. The moment Eduardo held those documents in his hands, he knew the fight was almost over. The Blackwells had spent years shaping his fate. Now he was about to take it back. But some wars don't end with a single victory, and Eduardo's final battle was still ahead. Eduardo had prepared for their resistance, but nothing could have braced him for the depth of their betrayal. The Blackwells weren't just trying to discredit him, they were trying to destroy him. Legal threats, frozen accounts, false accusations. They were throwing everything at him, desperate to maintain control. But Eduardo had come too far to break now. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for his very existence. Then came the final blow. A leaked document, one Eduardo had never seen before. A contract signed decades ago, binding him to the Blackwell name in ways he hadn't imagined. It wasn't just an adoption. It was a transaction. He hadn't been chosen out of love. He had been purchased. The revelation shattered something inside him. Every memory, every moment of his childhood, none of it had been real. He hadn't been raised as a son. He had been raised as an asset, a perfectly groomed heir to a fortune that was never meant to be his. And the worst part? They had never planned on telling him the truth. Anna found him later that night, sitting alone in his office, the document clutched in his hands. She had seen him angry, determined, ruthless, but she had never seen him like this, silent, broken. "I was never their son," he said, his voice hollow. "I was their investment." The words cut deeper than he expected, because for the first time he truly felt lost. But Anna refused to let him stay in that darkness. "That doesn't define you," she said firmly. "They may have tried to own you, but they don't anymore. You get to decide who you are now." Eduardo looked at her, the weight of years pressing down on him. For so long, he had let others dictate his story. But Anna was right. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. He stood, the contract still in his grip. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about taking back what was his, not just his name but his life. The Blackwells had taken everything from him. Now it was time for him to return the favor. The war wasn't over, but soon it would be. Eduardo had spent his life making decisions that shaped empires. But this decision wasn't about business, it was about who he truly was. The Blackwells had controlled his past, but they would not control his future. He had the truth, the proof, and the power to dismantle everything they had built. But what would that make him? Anna watched as he paced the room, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. She had waited years for this, to find her brother, to bring him home. But now that the truth was out, she feared what it would cost him. "You don't have to fight them their way," she said gently. "You can choose something different." But Eduardo wasn't sure what different looked like. Revenge was easy. It was familiar. He could destroy the Blackwells with one press release, one legal move. But then what? Would it bring him peace? Or would it make him exactly like them? The man they had raised him to be, ruthless, calculated, unyielding. He had spent so long defining himself by what they wanted. Now, for the first time, he had the chance to decide for himself. He thought about the years he had lost, the family he never knew. But he also thought about Anna, about the future still waiting for him. He couldn't change the past, but he could choose how his story ended. Then, Eduardo did something unexpected. He let go. He released his grip on the war he had been preparing to fight. The Blackwells had stolen his past, but he refused to let them steal his future. Instead of revenge, he chose something more powerful, freedom. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Eduardo Blackwell steps down, renounces Blackwell fortune. The world was stunned. The empire that had defined him was no longer his. He had walked away from it all. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he had lost, he felt like he had won. Anna found him later, standing by the window, watching the sunrise. "So what now?" she asked. Eduardo smiled for the first time in what felt like years. "Now," he said, "we start over." Eduardo had always believed that power was everything. Now, as he stood on the other side of his old life, he realized how empty that belief had been. Walking away from the Blackwells wasn't just about abandoning their name, it was about reclaiming his own. For the first time, he wasn't defined by them. He was free. The fallout was immediate. The media speculated endlessly. Investors panicked. The Blackwells scrambled to contain the damage. But Eduardo didn't care. Their world was crumbling, and he had no intention of saving it. Let them fight over the ruins. He had something far more valuable waiting for him. Anna stayed by his side through it all. She had spent years wondering if she would ever find her brother. Now he was here. And yet, she knew the battle inside him wasn't over. Healing didn't happen overnight. Letting go of a lifetime of lies wasn't easy. But Eduardo wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. There were still moments of doubt. Times when he questioned if he had done the right thing. Could he really leave it all behind? Was he strong enough to build a life outside the only world he had ever known? But then, he would look at Anna, at the family he had almost lost, and he knew the answer. Eduardo took a deep breath, stepping onto a path he had never dared to walk before. This was a new beginning, one built on truth instead of deception. He had always thought his destiny was written in stone. Now he saw it for what it really was, a choice. The Blackwells had tried to control his fate, but they had failed. He wasn't their heir, their creation, their possession. He was Eduardo, and for the first time in his life, that was enough. As he and Anna walked away from the chaos, she turned to him with a soft smile. "Where do we go from here?" Eduardo exhaled, feeling lighter than he ever had before. "Anywhere we want." Eduardo had spent his life chasing success, but for the first time, he wasn't running toward power, he was running toward something real. The future stretched before him, uncertain but full of possibilities. He no longer carried the weight of a name that wasn't his. Now he had the freedom to choose his own path. Anna had always imagined what it would be like to have a brother. Now that she had found him, she realized their journey was just beginning. They had lost years, but they wouldn't lose anymore. Eduardo had spent his life believing he had no family. Now he had one standing right beside him, and she wasn't going anywhere. There were still loose ends. The scars of the past didn't disappear overnight. The Blackwells had fallen, but their influence still lingered. Eduardo knew he would always carry their shadow, but it no longer defined him. He had won the battle that mattered most, the battle for himself. Opportunities came knocking, business ventures, media offers, endless speculation about his next move. But for once, Eduardo didn't care about any of it. He had spent enough time building an empire. Now he wanted to build a life. He and Anna stood at the edge of the city, looking out over the skyline. A place that had once felt like a battlefield now felt like a blank canvas. "So," Anna said with a smirk, "what does a former billionaire do with his life?" Eduardo chuckled, shaking his head. "For the first time, I have no idea, and I think I like it." The future was unknown, but for once that didn't scare him. It excited him, because this time the story was his to write, and he was just getting started. Eduardo had spent his life chasing success, but for the first time he wasn't running toward power, he was running toward something real. The future stretched before him, uncertain but full of possibilities. He no longer carried the weight of a name that wasn't his. Now he had the freedom to choose his own path. Anna had always imagined what it would be like to have a brother. Now that she had found him, she realized their journey was just beginning. They had lost years, but they wouldn't lose anymore. Eduardo had spent his life believing he had no family. Now he had one standing right beside him, and she wasn't going anywhere. There were still loose ends. The scars of the past didn't disappear overnight. The Blackwells had fallen, but their influence still lingered. Eduardo knew he would always carry their shadow, but it no longer defined him. He had won the battle that mattered most, the battle for himself. Opportunities came knocking, business ventures, media offers, endless speculation about his next move. But for once, Eduardo didn't care about any of it. He had spent enough time building an empire. Now he wanted to build a life. He and Anna stood at the edge of the city, looking out over the skyline. A place that had once felt like a battlefield now felt like a blank canvas. "So," Anna said with a smirk, "what does a former billionaire do with his life?" Eduardo chuckled, shaking his head. "For the first time, I have no idea, and I think I like it." The future was unknown, but for once that didn't scare him. It excited him, because this time the story was his to write, and he was just getting started.